The rain fell in relentless, gray sheets, turning the city lights into blurry constellations of neon and sorrow. Inside the small Korean restaurant, the scent of kimchi and sesame oil hung heavy in the air, a familiar comfort that did little to soothe the coiled knot of anxiety in Anis's stomach. At 23, she had learned to live with that knot, a constant companion in a life lived on the frayed edges of solvency. She wiped down the last table, her movements economical and weary. The clock on the wall ticked past 10, each second a slow drip of exhaustion. Her boss, Mr. Park, was in his office, and the silence from that closed door was more menacing than his usual stream of clipped, critical remarks. She could feel his gaze on her even through the wood, a greasy, possessive weight that made her skin crawl. He owned the restaurant, but he acted as if he owned her, too. Anis stacked the last of the chairs, her reflection a tired ghost in the darkened window. She just wanted to go home to her tiny, drafty apartment, lock the door, and breathe air that didn't feel owned by someone else. A sharp, hesitant knock echoed from the front door, startling her. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw the hunched silhouette of an old woman, her small frame battered by the wind. The restaurant was closed, the sign flipped, the rules absolute. Mr. Park would be furious. Anis hesitated for only a moment, her own weariness eclipsed by the sight of the woman's shivering form. She thought of her own grandmother, of the universal language of cold and hunger. With a deep breath that felt like a small rebellion, she walked to the door and unlocked it. The old woman stumbled inside, dripping water onto the freshly mopped floor. She was Korean, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes dark and clouded with a deep, unsettling sadness. She clutched a thin, worn coat around herself, looking less like a customer and more like a refugee from the storm. "Come," she said, guiding the woman to a small table in the corner, away from the prying eyes of the office. "Seat. I'll get you something warm." The old woman, who introduced herself haltingly as Mrs. Kim, sat with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her drenched and disheveled state. Anis moved with purpose to the kitchen, the familiar space now feeling like a sanctuary for her small act of defiance. She ladled a generous portion of the day's leftover doenjangjigi, a hearty fermented soybean stew, into a bowl. The rich, earthy aroma filled the small space, a scent of home and nourishment. She added a bowl of rice and a few slices of soft, crustless bread she'd been saving for her own meager dinner. She placed the steaming meal in front of Mrs. Kim, whose eyes widened with a gratitude so profound it was painful to witness. The woman bowed her head slightly, a gesture of deep respect that made Anis feel both humbled and ashamed of her own initial hesitation. "Please," Anis urged gently. "Eat." Mrs. Kim ate with a slow, deliberate hunger, as if savoring each spoonful. Anis sat across from her, not wanting to crowd her, but also not wanting to leave her alone. In the shared silence, a fragile connection formed. Anis saw not just a hungry stranger, but a woman who had known hardship, whose tired eyes held stories Anis could only guess at. When Mrs. Kim finished, she tried to press a few crumpled bills into Anis's hand. Anis gently pushed her hand away. "No, please." It was leftover, a lie, but a necessary one. "You are kind," Mrs. Kim said, her English heavily accented but clear. Her gaze was sharp, analytical, as if she were seeing past Anis's worn uniform and into the core of her. The quiet moment was shattered when the office door creaked open. Mr. Park emerged, his face a thundercloud of fury. His eyes darted from the flipped closed sign to Mrs. Kim, then settled on Anis with venomous intensity. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "I told you no one after 10. No 1 inch." He strode toward their table, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. "She was hungry," Anis said, standing up, trying to place herself between him and the old woman. "I was cleaning. It was no trouble. I don't pay you to run a charity," he snarled, his face unpleasantly close. "I pay you to obey." "You are costing me money." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep with bruising force. "You are stupid, disobedient. Anise flinched, a familiar wave of fear and humiliation washing over her. But this time it was different. It wasn't just her being degraded. It was happening in front of the vulnerable woman she had tried to help. Across the table, Mrs. Kim's expression had transformed. The gentle gratitude was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger that was startling in its intensity. Her eyes were fixed on Mr. Park's hand clamped around Anise's arm, and her lips pressed into a thin, unforgiving line. The front door of the restaurant opened without a sound, a slice of the dark, wet night invading the tense stillness of the room. A man stood framed in the doorway, a figure of such stark, controlled power that the air itself seemed to thin around him. He was tall and dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that shed the rain without a trace of dampness. His face was a study in impassive angles and shadows, handsome but remote, his black hair impeccably styled. Behind him, two other men stood like stone sentinels, their presence amplifying his own. His eyes, dark and chillingly perceptive, swept the room in a single, comprehensive glance that missed nothing. They took in the humble decor, the steaming, empty bowl on the table, the frightened waitress, and the furious owner. Then, his gaze landed on Mr. Park's hand, still gripping Anise's arm. The air crackled. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply looked, and in that look was a judgment so absolute it felt like a physical force. Mr. Park froze, his tirade dying in his throat. The color drained from his face, replaced by a pasty, sickly white. He recognized the man, or at least the aura of untouchable authority that clung to him like a shroud. This was not a customer. This was not a random passerby. This was danger, quiet and refined and utterly lethal. Anise felt Mr. Park's grip slacken, his knuckles losing their bloodless white. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She didn't know who this newcomer was, but his arrival had shifted the very gravity of the room. The oppressive atmosphere of Mr. Park's petty tyranny evaporated, replaced by a much larger, colder, and more profound sense of dread. The old woman, Mrs. Kim, broke the suffocating silence. She spoke in Korean, her voice no longer frail, but carrying a tone of regal command. Her words were directed at the man in the doorway. He inclined his head almost imperceptibly, his gaze never leaving Mr. Park. Then Mrs. Kim looked at Anise, and her next words, though spoken in Korean, were clearly about her. A soft, almost maternal tone had entered her voice. Finally, she gestured toward the man and said, in English for Anise's benefit, the two words that sealed Mr. Park's fate. My son, the man, Min-jun, finally moved. He took a single, silent step into the restaurant, and it felt like a king entering his court. Min-jun's movements were fluid and economical, devoid of any wasted energy. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a weapon. He stopped a few feet from their table, his attention fully on the terrified restaurant owner. His voice, when he finally spoke, was unnervingly quiet, a low murmur that barely carried, yet every syllable was laced with steel. Let her go, he said in Korean. It was not a command filled with anger. It was a simple statement of an unalterable fact. Mr. Park snatched his hand back from Anise's arm as if he'd been burned, bowing low from the waist, a torrent of frantic, stammered apologies spilling from his lips. He was trembling visibly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the room. Min-jun paid him no mind, his dismissal so complete it was more insulting than any verbal rebuke. His dark eyes shifted to Anise. For the first time, she saw something other than cold authority in them. The chilling intensity softened, not into warmth, but into a focused, analytical concern. It was the look of a man assessing damage. Are you hurt? He asked, his English perfect and unaccented. Anise could only shake her head, her throat too tight to form words. She instinctively rubbed the spot on her arm where Mr. Park's fingers had been, a phantom ache remaining. Min-jun's gaze followed the movement, and a flicker of something glacial and dangerous passed through his eyes before being suppressed. He turned his attention back to the room, to her. You will not work here again, he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. You will collect your things. You are coming with us, Anis's mind reeled.
Leave?
With him? A man whose silent presence had terrified her abusive boss into a bowing, scraping mess? It was trading one fear for another, larger and more unknown. Yet, as she looked from Mr. Park's pathetic, cowering form to Min-jun's calm, commanding stillness, she felt a strange, illogical sense of safety emanating from the more dangerous man. He was a predator, she had no doubt, but his predatory nature was not directed at her. It was aimed at the world on her behalf. Her life here was a dead end of exhaustion and fear. Her apartment was just a place to sleep. She had nothing to lose. My purse, she whispered, her voice hoarse. And my coat. Get them, Min-jun said, his gaze flicking to one of his men, who immediately stepped forward to escort her. As she walked to the small staff room, she felt Min-jun's eyes on her back, not in the leering way of Mr. Park, but with a watchful, protective quality that was entirely new to her. She grabbed her worn bag and thin jacket, her hands shaking. When she returned, Mrs. Kim was standing, her composure fully restored. Min-jun placed a light, respectful hand on his mother's back, guiding her toward the door. He paused and looked at Anis, waiting. She walked toward him, stepping out of the oppressive humidity of the restaurant and into the clean, cold night air, leaving Mr. Park to his ruin in the silent, empty room. The car was a black sedan, so luxurious it felt like a different world. The interior was silent, insulated from the noise of the rain and the city. Anis sat in the back with Mrs. Kim, while Min-jun sat in the front passenger seat. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was a weighted, purposeful silence. Anis watched the city lights smear past the window, a blur of a life she was rapidly leaving behind. She didn't know where she was going, but for the first time in a long time, the knot in her stomach had begun to loosen. They drove for what felt like an eternity, climbing higher and higher into the more affluent parts of the city, where the buildings were sleek towers of glass and steel. The car pulled into a private underground garage and stopped. Min-jun led the way to a private elevator, which ascended with a smooth, silent rush. The doors opened directly into a penthouse apartment. Anis's breath caught in her throat. The space was immense, a minimalist expanse of white walls, polished concrete floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, godlike view of the entire city glittering below. The furniture was sparse but exquisite, each piece a work of art. It was beautiful, sterile, and as intimidating as the man who owned it. Mrs. Kim was led away by one of the men to what Anis presumed was a guest suite. Min-jun turned to Anis, his expression unreadable in the soft, recessed lighting. "This is my home," he said simply. "You will stay here. You will be safe." He gestured toward a closed door. "That room is yours. There are clothes and anything else you might need. Food is in the kitchen. Make yourself comfortable." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, noting her thin jacket and worn-out shoes. "Rest," he said, the single word imbued with a quiet authority that was somehow comforting. And then he was gone, disappearing into another part of the vast apartment, leaving her utterly alone. Anis stood frozen in the center of the living room, feeling small and out of place. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. She slowly walked to the wall of windows, pressing her hand against the cool glass. The city sprawled beneath her, a carpet of light and shadow. Down there was her old life, her tiny apartment, Mr. Park's grubby restaurant. It felt a million miles away. This place was a cage, she knew, but it was a gilded one, and for the first time, the bars felt like protection, not imprisonment. She cautiously opened the door to the room he had indicated. It was another minimalist space, dominated by a large, comfortable-looking bed and another window with a stunning view. On the bed were neatly folded clothes, soft sweaters, comfortable pants, all in neutral colors and clearly new. In the adjoining bathroom, every toiletry she could possibly need was arranged with meticulous care. He had thought of everything. The sheer, quiet efficiency of his care was more staggering than any overt kindness would have been. Exhaustion, deep and bone-weary, finally washed over her. She stripped off her damp clothes, leaving them in a heap on the floor like a snakeskin she was shedding, and slid under the cool, crisp sheets of the bed. For the first time in years, Anis fell asleep without fear. The next few days passed in a strange, silent rhythm. Anis woke late each morning to the soft gray light of the city filling her room. The apartment was always quiet. Minjun was a phantom presence. She would find fresh food in the refrigerator, a pot of gently steaming tea on the counter, but she rarely saw him. He moved through the massive space with a ghost-like quietness, his work and his life a complete mystery to her. She spent her time exploring the apartment, a silent castaway on a luxurious island. She'd run her hands over the cool marble countertops, trace the lines of the expensive furniture, and spend hours just sitting by the window, watching the city breathe below. The initial fear she'd felt began to slowly recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She was a prisoner, in a sense, but one who was treated with a distant, almost reverent respect. He never entered her room. He never questioned her. He simply provided a bubble of absolute safety and left her to exist within it. One afternoon, she was curled on the large sofa, reading a book she'd found on a sparse shelf, when he entered the living room. She tensed, her instinct for caution still sharp. He didn't look at her immediately, instead moving to the kitchenette to pour himself a glass of water. He moved with a controlled grace that was captivating to watch. He was always in a dark suit, always immaculate, a figure of stark contrast against the white backdrop of his home. "I have dealt with your former employer," he said, his back still to her. The statement hung in the air, clinical and final. "He will not be a problem again," Anis swallowed. She didn't ask for details. She didn't want to know. The finality in his tone was enough. "Thank you," she whispered. He finally turned, his dark eyes meeting hers across the vast room. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Anis felt like he was seeing everything, every fear she'd ever had, every small hope she'd clung to. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet, unnerving stillness. "There is no need for thanks," he said, his voice low. "My mother was in your debt. I am simply balancing the ledger." He made it sound like a business transaction, stripping the moment of any personal sentiment. Yet, his eyes lingered on her for a fraction of a second too long, a subtle crack in his impassive facade. He would leave food for her, simple meals that were always perfectly prepared. One evening, it was a bowl of juk, a gentle rice porridge she remembered her own grandmother making when she was sick. The gesture was so specific, so thoughtful, it felt more intimate than any conversation. She began to watch for him, for the sound of his key in the door, for the brief moments when their paths would cross in the silent expanse of the apartment. His presence was no longer a source of fear, but a strange, anchoring comfort. He was the storm, and he was the shelter, all at once. The gnawing anxiety that had been Anis's constant companion for years began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, dissolve. The safety of the penthouse, once sterile and intimidating, started to feel like a cocoon. Without the daily grind of survival and the constant threat of Mr. Park's harassment, parts of herself she thought were long dead began to stir. She found a forgotten sketchpad and a few charcoal pencils in the bottom of her purse, relics from a time when she dreamed of being an artist. One evening, drawn by the mesmerizing tapestry of lights, she sat on the floor by the window and began to draw. Her fingers felt stiff and clumsy at first, but soon the old muscle memory returned. She lost herself in the lines and shadows, sketching the jagged silhouette of the skyline against the soft glow of the twilight sky. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear Minjun enter. He stood silently in the archway of the living room, watching her. She only noticed him when she felt the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, the faint weight of his gaze. She looked up, startled, a flush of self-consciousness rising in her cheeks. She expected him to ignore her, to walk past as he usually did. Instead, he walked slowly toward the window, his polished shoes making no sound on the concrete floor. He didn't look at her drawing, but at the view she was capturing. "The city looks peaceful from up here," he said, his voice a low murmur beside her. His proximity was unnerving, yet not threatening. It was the first time he had willingly stood so close to her. "It's the first time it's ever felt that way to me," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The confession hung between them, a small, fragile bridge of shared understanding. He looked from the city back to her, and for a fleeting moment, his mask of cool detachment slipped. She saw a flicker of something that looked like empathy, a shared recognition of the world's ugliness and the rare beauty of a safe harbor. He gave a single, sharp nod, as if acknowledging a truth she had just revealed, and then he turned and left as silently as he had arrived. The next evening, when Anise returned to her spot by the window, she found a brand-new, professional-grade art set waiting for her on the low table. A beautiful wooden box filled with an array of charcoals, graphite pencils of varying hardness, and thick, textured paper. There was no note. He never mentioned it. The gift was as silent and anonymous as all his other acts of care. Anise ran her fingers over the smooth wood of the box, a lump forming in her throat. He hadn't praised her art or offered empty encouragement. He had simply seen her, seen a nascent passion, and provided the tools for it to grow. The gesture was more profound than any compliment, a quiet validation that spoke directly to her soul. She picked up a new piece of charcoal, the weight of it solid and real in her hand, and felt a genuine, unburdened smile touch her lips for the first time in a very long time. Weeks turned into a month. Anise's sketches filled a portfolio, her confidence growing with each completed drawing. The penthouse no longer felt like a cage, but a studio, a sanctuary. But a small, nagging part of her knew she couldn't stay suspended in this strange, protected reality forever. There were pieces of her old life she needed to reclaim, not because she wanted them back, but because she needed to be the one to let them go. She had a box of her mother's things, a few faded photographs, a worn silver locket, a handful of letters, stored in her old apartment. It was the only part of her past that mattered. She found Min-jun in his study, a room she had never entered, poring over documents at a large, dark wood desk. He looked up as she hesitated in the doorway, his expression patient. "I need to go out," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I left some things at my old apartment." Personal things. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The idea of her returning to that world, even for a moment, clearly displeased him. "It is not safe, I know," she said, meeting his gaze. "But I need to do it. They're my mother's things. It's all I have of her." She saw a flicker of conflict in his eyes. His instinct was to forbid it, to keep her locked away where he could guarantee her safety. But he also saw the resolve in her face, the quiet strength that had been growing within her. To deny her this would be to treat her as a possession, not a person. "I will take you," he said finally, his tone brokering no argument. The ride back to her old neighborhood was a jarring descent. The sleek, silent sedan felt like a spaceship landing on a forgotten planet. The buildings were grimy, the streets littered with trash. The air felt thick and heavy with struggle. Min-jun's face was a mask of granite as he took in her former reality. He parked the car, and his two ever-present guards materialized, flanking them as they walked toward the dilapidated apartment building. Anise felt a pang of shame, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of detachment. This was no longer her world. As they reached the crumbling front steps, a figure stumbled out from the shadows of the alley next to the building. It was Mr. Park. He looked wild, unkempt. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes bloodshot and crazed. He'd clearly been waiting, stalking the building. "Anise!" he cried out, his voice a desperate rasp. He lunged toward her, his face a mess of pathetic pleading and fury. "You have to come back. Please. He ruined me. That man, he's a monster. You don't know what he is." He reached for her, his hand grasping for her arm, a grotesque echo of their last encounter in the restaurant. Before Mr. Park's fingers could even brush the fabric of her sleeve, Min-jun moved. It wasn't a rush. It was a blur of lethal efficiency, a seamless unfolding of power. He stepped in front of Anise, shielding her completely with his body. One hand shot out and clamped around Mr. Park's throat, not to choke him, but simply to arrest his motion. With no visible effort, Minjun slammed him back against the grimy brick wall of the building. The impact sent a puff of dust into the air. Mr. Park's feet dangled inches above the ground, his eyes wide with sheer terror, his desperate pleas turning into choked gurgles. Minjun leaned in close, his body a solid wall of immovable force. His other hand remained casually in his pocket. He didn't raise his voice. His words were a low, venomous whisper, meant only for Mr. Park but vibrating with an intensity that Anis could feel from behind him. "I gave you a warning," Minjun breathed, his voice colder than a grave. "You were told to disappear. Now you will learn the consequence of disobedience." He held the man there for a long, suffocating moment, letting the terror sink in, letting Mr. Park understand the absolute totality of his powerlessness. "You will never come near her again," Minjun continued, his voice dropping even lower, each word a spike of ice. "You will not speak her name. You will not think her name. You will take what little you have left, and you will vanish. If I ever see your face again, or even hear a rumor that you are in this city, I will erase you from this world. Do you understand?" Mr. Park managed a series of frantic, desperate nods, tears of pure fear streaming down his face. Minjun held him for another second, then released him as abruptly as he had seized him. Mr. Park collapsed to the pavement in a boneless heap, gasping and sobbing. He scrambled backward like a crab, then lurched to his feet and fled down the street, disappearing into the urban decay without a single look back. The entire violent episode had lasted less than 30 seconds. Minjun stood for a moment, his back still to Anis, his posture rigid. Then he slowly turned. His face was a calm, impassive mask once more, but his eyes, dark and intense, searched hers. He wasn't looking for gratitude. He was looking for fear. He was checking to see if his display of brutal power had frightened her, if he had become the monster in her eyes. Anis met his gaze. She wasn't afraid. A strange, powerful calm had settled over her. She had seen true monstrosity in Mr. Park's pathetic, entitled cruelty. What she had just witnessed from Minjun was not monstrous. It was a shield. It was a final, decisive act of protection. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand gently on the sleeve of his suit jacket. His arm was tense as steel beneath the fine fabric. The contact was brief, a light touch, but it was electric. "Thank you," she said, and this time, the words were not a whisper. They were clear and steady. His eyes softened, the hard, dangerous edge receding, and he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The last thread to her old life, the one woven from fear and intimidation, had just been violently, irrevocably severed. They retrieved the box of her mother's things from the apartment without another word. The small, dusty room looked even sadder and more transient than she remembered. Holding the box, Anis felt a sense of closure, not of loss. Back in the pristine silence of the penthouse, the atmosphere had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. The confrontation with Mr. Park had been a necessary exorcism. The last ghost of Anis's fear had been banished, not by her, but for her. The space, which had shifted from a cage to a sanctuary, now felt like something else entirely, a home. The invisible barrier between them, the one maintained by his controlled distance and her cautious fear, had dissolved. That evening, they didn't retreat to their separate spaces. Anis sat on the sofa, the box of her mother's photos open on her lap. Minjun didn't go to his study. He sat in a low armchair nearby, nursing a small glass of whiskey, the amber liquid glowing in the soft light. They sat in a comfortable, shared silence for a long time, the only sound the faint hum of the city far below. It wasn't awkward or tense. It was settled. It was peaceful. Finally, Minjun broke the quiet, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble. "My mother calls me every day," he said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "She asks about you." Anis looked up from a faded picture of her mother laughing. "She does." "Every day," he confirmed. He took a slow sip, his eyes on the city lights. "She believes you have a kind soul. She says she saw it the moment you opened the door for her." He paused, turning his gaze from the window to her. It was direct, open, and held a warmth she had never seen there before. "She is rarely wrong about people," a soft smile touched Anis's lips. "She was just a woman who was cold and hungry. Anyone would have done the same thing." Minjun's expression was serious, his gaze unwavering. "No," he said, his voice soft but absolutely certain. "They wouldn't have. Most people see a problem and look away. You saw a person and opened the door in that moment. An entire conversation passed between them without a single additional word. It was an acknowledgement of everything that had happened. The fear, the rescue, the quiet healing, the violent protection. It was not a grand declaration of love. Nothing so clumsy or overt. It was something quieter, deeper, and more resilient. It was an unspoken promise of continued safety, of mutual respect, of a shared future built not on passion, but on the solid, unshakable foundation of his unwavering protection and her own, newly reclaimed strength. He was the most feared man in the city, a creature of shadows and power, but in her presence, he was simply Minjun, the man who brought her tea, bought her art supplies, and stood as an unbreakable shield between her and the world. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a monster or a savior, but a partner. And in his eyes, she saw her own reflection, no longer a victim, but a woman who was finally, peacefully, home.